Most language learners never get fluent, and that's not from a lack of talent. It's just because they're missing a few key habits that all polyglots have in common. So if you're done wasting time, here are 5 simple things you can implement today that took me from speaking just one language to now 5. The first tip alone could actually save you hundreds of hours, but unfortunately most people tend to ignore it. And I call it meta learning. So this has happened to me and probably many others too. You feel like learning a language and you're like, ooh, okay, let me download Duolingo or some other app. And then you just get started, you learn a little bit, but you don't really know what you're doing. And the problem with that, although you're taking action, which is a good thing, is that you have no real direction and you're not even sure what to prioritize. A good analogy here is like you're trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean, but you just get in the water and start swimming right away. Like, yeah, you're making faster initial progress, but what's going to happen a tenth of the way there? You're probably just going to drown, right? But there's a very simple fix to this, which is just spending some time initially trying to actually find a boat, or in this case, learning what and how to learn it. So what this could look like for your routine is just initially spending some time getting familiar with a few effective language learning techniques more in general. For example, how to most effectively study vocabulary or grammar or listen, etc., etc. And then also learn a few specific things about the language that you're learning as well, especially if you're sort of in the beginning stages of learning it. This is stuff like, does the language have any weird grammatical rules, like no plural or plural? Does it have a different word order? Things like that. Also, if it has a different writing system, how do you approach learning that? These are things that aren't universal for every language, but they're really, really good to know so that you can study, so that you can structure a very effective study plan for it. This will take a little bit of time up front, and you won't get as good as quickly, but then when you actually do start learning, you're going to make way faster progress than if you hadn't done this. One of the most effective ways to learn a language is via listening and reading. Input. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. But most people actually use it wrong, I think. See, there's a lot of good research done on the topic on how to optimally use input, and so applying just a few small tweaks can actually give you way better returns. Now, I like dividing this into 2 buckets. First one is content selection, which kind of content you actually consume, and the second are enhancement techniques for that specific input. The first and probably most important thing, or second most important thing, is how difficult the input actually is. So in the research, it's generally shown that you want to have a very, very high level of understanding. And the reason for this is very simple. If something is way too difficult, your brain is just going to stress out way too much in attempting to kind of solve that puzzle. So generally speaking, somewhere between 80 to 98% comprehension is sort of the sweet spot, depending on if you choose to use any of the enhancement techniques that I'm going to mention later. For reading, you probably want it to be around 95 to 98% comprehensible, and for listening, you can go a little bit lower. But fundamentally, it has to be very understandable. And secondly, it also has to be very enjoyable. This is due to a phenomenon called the affective filter, which basically says that, of course, if you don't like something, you're not going to do it, but this also says that you're just not going to pick up as much language in general from something you don't enjoy. So me watching knitting videos is not going to be super effective because I'm just not interested in knitting. Simple. Now on top of that, something I found very effective and the research actually supports it is also something called narrow input, narrow reading, narrow listening, which basically means picking something and repeating it. So picking one show and watching that show only for a certain period of time, not swapping between 10 different ones. The reason for this is pretty simple. It takes a lot of exposure to a single word or a grammar structure before your brain actually understands it fully. So you want to make sure that it gets that repetition. And some simple enhancement techniques you can use that I found really, really useful are things that have to do with multimodal learning in general. So this means using multiple different things that your brain can draw conclusions from and kind of use as context, which could mean subtitles, but also something that is very, very important, visuals. The more things that are shown in the video or the thing that you're watching the more effective it's going to be. This is why I personally really like, for example, travel videos and cooking videos. I found those to be extremely beneficial, especially when starting out in a language, because they're showing so much of what they're doing. If someone is showing a new building or a certain area, they might mention the word train station and you actually see the train station and so on. This is generally going to be way more effective than just listening to someone have a monologue like I'm doing currently. Now, input, even with all the enhancements in the world, is really effective, but if that's all you do forever, you're really going to have a hard time. I started learning Spanish by essentially just studying grammar and vocabulary, and at first, that actually worked really, really well. I got fast results, I felt like I was learning things, I could construct basic sentences, and all was good. But the problem is that whenever I tried to listen to something, I felt like my brain lagged behind like 5 seconds at least, and whenever I tried speaking, I just sucked at it straight up. That's when I had one of my most important realizations, which was that what got me to one level is not necessarily going to get me to the next. And so a good general study plan that I found works well to get you through the different levels is starting off in the first few months, doing quite a lot of explicit study actually. This is stuff like flashcards, a textbook, things like that to get the basics down. Even if they're boring, they work, okay? So just do them. And then after a few months, you want to start listening and reading more, and also speaking a little bit to kind of cement that knowledge and add a lot of context. And I'm not saying to never do this in the beginning, by the way, but this is just what you want to prioritize. And then after maybe 6 to 24 months, kind of depends on the language you're learning, speak a lot more, and also keep listening, but start phasing out that kind of traditional study because it's not going to have as high of an ROI after, you've passed the kind of beginner to lower intermediate stage. At first, you also want to make sure that you prioritize high frequency vocabulary and common everyday topics. Because the big problem apps like Duolingo or certain textbooks have is that they essentially, from the get-go, try to introduce you to topics like owls and insects and whatnot at the same time as they're trying to teach you how to say, hello, my name is this. And that's just not going to get you enough repetitions of the important stuff to actually get that down in the first place, which is pretty much the foundation of what you need to be able to speak and hold a conversation and also just understand content in the first place. And so prioritize on everyday topics in the beginning, and then later on you can dive deeper into your specific hobbies, and also if you want to develop some more, complex vocabulary or academic skills or whatever your interests are. If you want some help building an individualized study plan that will actually work for you, your goals and your interests, I offer one-on-one coaching, so click the first link in the description to see if I can help. But the only problem is, even with the best study plan in the world, most people still won't do it, because it's just uncomfortable. And that's where tip 4 comes in. If there's one thing that separates beginner learners from more advanced learners, this has to be it. Successful language learners embrace the messiness. You'll find some parts of the language hard. That's okay. You'll sometimes mess up when speaking. That's okay. And you won't understand everything you hear. That's okay too. As a language learner, you have to embrace this messiness and get used to this, because that's ultimately where you're going to grow. Effective language learning is rarely completely effortless. Yes, you should want to do it. You should want to have some underlying motivation or something that's telling you that you want to get fluent in the language. And you should also not be completely overwhelmed to the point where you're stressing out every time you're learning. But ultimately, a little bit of stress is actually where your brain is going to learn the most. See, learning anything happens through a process called encoding. This is basically where new information you're taking in gets stored into a memory that you can later on retrieve and actually use for practical things. The problem here, though, is that this is done through deep processing. And deep processing is actually the single thing that helps this connection stick and really build stronger and stronger. And so if you never allow yourself to struggle, this is never going to happen. So just remember that every time something feels a little bit hard, of course, don't let it feel too hard, but a little bit hard is actually the sweet spot where you're going to be making the most gains possible. Now, if you want to make this process of encoding even easier, that's where tip 5 comes in. I used to study haphazardly, whenever I wanted, essentially however I wanted. And that worked up until a point. I mean, I got something done, but the problem is that I never really made the progress that I actually wanted. To learn a language, it takes a lot of time. So you gotta make sure that if you want to achieve this goal, you block out some time every day or at least multiple times a week, and you protect that time like it's your number one mission in life. What this could look like for you is blocking out maybe an hour a day in the morning or at night or whenever you can actually do it to sit down and study focused. So please, don't be like doing handstands at the same time as you're texting 20 people and like listening to a podcast at the same time and trying to recite the alphabet or whatever. You want to make sure that you're focusing on one thing and doing it as effectively as possible, because while language learning takes time, it's not just the time that counts, it is also the effort and the focus that you put in during that time. Applying just these 5 simple principles will make sure that you're learning more effectively than 99% of other people. But for even better gains, you should watch the video on screen right here where I go over 20 lessons that'll help you maximize the effectiveness of your language learning. I'll see you guys there. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, keep learning.